Well, it's great to be with you today. Thank you for the invitation. Just a little sideline that I just want to mention before I start is a few years ago I started having trouble with my eyes watering. My eye doctor said that my eyelids were wearing out just like the windshield wipers, only they're not quite as easy to change. He said he could shorten them. I said, oh, they're not that bad yet, but they are getting worse later this last while. So if I have to dry my eyes during the sermon, don't get alarmed. I'm not mad, not sad, not glad. My wife says you can cry when you're glad too, but that's no big deal, so don't worry about it. It's good to be with you. I enjoyed all the children this morning. It's good to have a church with children in it. I preach around in half a dozen different churches, a couple of Sundays a month, and some of them don't even have any children, and so it's great to have children here. Also wanted to express the gratitude for, we've been attending the community Lent services at Sunday nights, and several of you have been at some of those, and I appreciate the effort to be together. I'm a huge believer in unity and getting together. John 17 is Jesus' prayer for unity. My mother lived about 3 years longer than she should have bedridden in the care home, and I read her favorite chapter was John 17. As I read it over hundreds of times, I thought, we're not doing a real good job at this. I'm a little worried when Jesus gets back and says, what part of John 17 didn't you understand? And so I'm a huge believer in unity and getting together. And so I appreciate the effort to be together. I don't know how many sermons that you've heard on resurrection. It's Resurrection Sunday, of course, so this is the Sunday. I've been going to church for just about 77 years, so I've heard at least 60 or 70 sermons on resurrection, plus some at other times of the year. I was thinking about getting ready for this. I've probably heard 100 sermons on the resurrection. How many of you heard? Quite a few, probably. And so I was thinking about it and thinking, what could I share that might be new or might be useful or might be interesting that you haven't heard before or you haven't thought of before? If I just get up and say Jesus is risen, he is risen, and you say he's risen indeed, and you've done that every year for 60 years, there's not much new. So we could skip the sermon and you could just get back to lunch earlier or whatever you need to do for the rest of the day. So I tried to think of something a little bit different for you. As I was getting ready for this, I reread the 4 gospel accounts. All 4 gospels give an account of the resurrection. Would recommend that to you, that maybe sometime today you spend some time rereading those 4 accounts from the 4 Gospels. But I was thinking that maybe it would be useful for you this morning to think about emotions. I don't know what you did on Friday. We had a very effective, emotional Good Friday service in the morning, and on Sunday evening we went to the Methodist Church in Woda, and there was a man there talking about Jews for Jesus and shared with us about the Passover and the different items from the Passover. He's a Jewish man, and so he understands all of the things from the Passover, and he explained the connection with all of those. It was very, very meaningful. So I had a rather emotional Friday. And Friday night, I kept saying to my wife, tomorrow seems like it should be Monday. And yesterday, as I was doing other things, I did a lot of thinking about wonder what the disciples were doing on Saturday after Jesus' crucifixion on Friday, and their total emotions that they went through were sometimes pretty hard on the disciples, and it's pretty easy to look back and think, how did they miss that? How could they not understand that? Why would they leave him? Why would they betray him? Why would they deny him? Why would they flee and run and leave? After all the things you've seen, you'd think, I'd have done better, wouldn't I? You'd have done better, wouldn't you? Stick right with Jesus to the end. It's pretty easy to be hard on them, but it's useful to think about the emotions. And so I want you to think this morning about contrasts. Contrast can quite often clarify things for us. If you've ever seen black, then you can appreciate white. If you've ever seen really bright sunshine, then you can understand the dark. If you've ever really been in the dark, like really dark, then you appreciate it when it's sunny and bright and light. You appreciate light. But you can't really appreciate one unless you have the other. If you've never been poor, you can't appreciate what it is to live in abundance that we live in today. If you've always lived in abundance, you really don't have much understanding of poverty and poor. If you've always lived in peace, as we've been blessed to, then it's difficult to understand war. But if you've lived through war, then you appreciate peace. My wife and I teach the English in the Ukrainians in Woda English lessons one night a week, and they understand war, and they appreciate peace. They don't complain about the taxes that they have to pay. They don't complain about anything with Mr. Trudeau or any other prime minister. They are so grateful to be at peace. But when we don't understand war, we complain about Ontario outvoting us and all of the other stuff that there is to complain about in Canada, because we really don't understand war. And I want you this morning to think about contrasts that the disciples would have had, and as a result, several of them contrasts that we have. Very few are totally extreme. It never does get 100% dark. I don't know if you've ever visited Carlsbad Caverns or some kind of cave like that, and they take the tourists down there and then they shut off the lights. I mean, it is dark. It's really not dark. It never is totally dark in our world. There's always some light. But if you think about it as extremes, extreme bright light or extreme dark, that's extremes, and we exist somewhere in the middle there. We kind of move back and forth, and that's what I want you to think about with emotions. The disciples experienced several of those, especially if you want to follow along in Luke 24. Think about Jesus has died, and now he's alive. They can't believe that he's going to die, and then when he's alive and the resurrection, they can't believe that he's alive. Luke 24, 5 and 6. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. Ephesians 2 tries to explain to us that we were dead in sin, but Christ has made us alive. If you don't understand dead, and if you don't really feel that you are truly a sinner and that you're dead and you're helpless and you can't look after this yourself, then you don't really fully appreciate grace and salvation. The disciples had a difficult time getting their head around dead and alive, and we have a difficult time getting our head around dead and alive. They for sure didn't understand crucified and raised, and crucified and the resurrection. Next couple verses in Luke 24. The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again. Then they remembered his words. Jesus tried several times to explain this to them, to tell them this is what was coming, but it just went right over top. But now they said, ah. And I want to encourage you to try to have moments, that every once in a while it just occurs to you, that's what he meant. We're going to have lots of those moments when we get to heaven. Jesus is going to say, what part of this didn't you understand? That's what you meant. And we'll be able to sympathize with the disciples a whole lot more. Especially this one, suffering to glory. Luke 24, 25, and 26. He said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. It's been talked about right through the Old Testament, but they knew the Old Testament. These people went to school, they learned serious, long parts memorized. They would be clearly familiar with the contents of it, but it really didn't sink. And it's pretty easy for us to be pretty familiar with this book, but it really doesn't sink. What part of this don't you understand? Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? Whenever suffering comes along, we don't really go for that, whether it's health or death or disaster or some other kind of suffering. But that's not quite so much fun. But the Bible is clear. Suffering comes before glory. Romans 8:17, we must share in his suffering before we can share in his glory. No suffering, no glory. That's a pretty serious contrast. That's a pretty serious verse for you to think about. I want to encourage you to quit asking the whys. When suffering comes along, just get rid of that word why. I'm part of a book club that we read spiritual books. It's about 10 of us in the book club, and we get together once a month. Our book for last September was a book, Stay in Your Lane, by Keith Thompson. It's a wonderful book. It's a pastor that uses a very simple concept to help people in counseling. When people come to him for all their troubles and things not going the way they want them and not going right, he draws 3 columns on a piece of paper. And he said, this is your lane, that's their lane, and this is God's lane. So your mother-in-law hates you and constantly working against you. What can you do about that? You cannot change her. What's in your lane? You can pray about it. You can try to be patient. You can try to be kind. You can try to, and he lists with them all of the things that's in your lane. What's in her lane? Her lane is her attitude and her behavior and her everything that you cannot change. That's her lane. Stay out of her lane. Stay in your lane. And why is she like that? that's in God's lane. For whatever reason, and every single problem that comes along, the why is always in God's lane. Why is never in your lane. Whatever suffering comes your way, the why is always in God's lane. I read John chapter 9 for several years before I figured out the blind man is blind, and the disciples, you remember the story, say, why is he blind? Is this some sin he did or some sin his parents did? That was the theological thought of the day. It's still around today. People still go through that reasoning. What's Jesus' answer? It's nothing to do with him. It's not in his lane. It's not in his parents' lane. It's in God's lane. God made it that way so that I could do the miracle today, so that you could have faith. So Jesus gives them the why that day, but we don't have the why. But I want to encourage you to quit asking why. Christians need to get rid of the word why, because that's always in God's lane and it's never in your lane. Suffering comes before glory. Count on it. Sufferings come from God in God's lane, the why, and the glory's in God's lane. It's not in your lane. Stay in your own lane. Traffic moves much better if you stay in your own lane. Get out of your lane, there's going to be a crash. Stay in your own lane. Next one. The disciples move from frightened to peace. They are terrified to where the person who was the surest that he would stick with Jesus forever freaks out and denies Jesus 3 times. He is scared stiff. Of course, we would have not been like that. The rest of them run. One of them, even, they grab a hold of his coat and he runs naked because he pulls his clothes off because he's scared stiff. I want to encourage you to try to work on your fear. I haven't counted them, but I'm told that 366 times in the Bible, the instruction is, do not be afraid. Fear does terrible things to us. Fear paralyzes us. Fear makes us do things that we wouldn't ordinarily do. Fear makes us miss out on all kinds of opportunities. Fear does some terrible things to us, just like it did to the disciples. And I encourage you to work on your fear. Verse 36 and 37, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. They're in this room, door locked tight, because they're still scared stiff. Maybe they're going to come and get us next. They are scared stiff. But Jesus comes to them and says, peace be with you. And whew, we move from frightened to peace. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. You remember when they were on the storm on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus comes walking on the water? They are terrified. It must be a ghost. What does Jesus say at that time to the storm? Peace, be still. Peace does marvelous things for us. One of the things I've got into in the last 10 years is called transition pastoring, helping churches move from one pastor to another. And for 16 months, I worked with a little Mennonite church south of Brandon by Wawanesa. And I learned about peace. All of us believe in peace. Just we have it way down the line. I probably had it about 44, and I moved peace up to number 4. Paul gives us faith, hope, and love. I think those are the top 3. And I think the next is peace. And I want to encourage you in your dealing with each other, in your dealing with yourself, that you move peace way up the line. Jesus moves peace way up there with his disciples. They're frightened, and he moves them to peace. Jesus just loved peace. He was constantly at peace. Jesus was not frightened. Fear is not a normal thing. Don't make excuses for being afraid. Don't say, oh, that's normal to be afraid. It's not. The normal is Jesus. The normal is to be at peace. Another emotion that they had, and maybe you've had this emotion this weekend, of sadness to joy. Verse 52, then they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Sometimes it's useful, Luke writing Luke, and then he writes Acts. And you might want to try this afternoon, reading that last chapter of Luke and read right into the first chapter of Acts. Jump over John, and it moves you from sadness to joy. Certainly they were moved from hiding to boldness. Verse 53, and they stayed continually at the temple praising God. And then they move into Acts, and we see the disciples have moved from hiding to boldness. We are not afraid of anybody. That's one of the greatest indications, proofs, evidence for us of the resurrection, is the difference in Peter, the difference in all of the disciples, to move from betrayal and denial to boldness. And I want to encourage you to move from hiding to boldness. I appreciate what Garth said a little earlier about being bold and sharing and proud of it. They moved from deserters to witnesses. Verse 48, you are witnesses of these things. I want to encourage you that that's our job. We get distracted with what's really our job. Sometimes we have no idea what is our job. In John 17, Jesus in his prayer to God says, he has finished what God gave him to do. On the cross, he said, it is finished. Paul says in Acts 24 that he has finished, completed the goal. I'm not sure how you decide whether you are finished or not. Finished is a wonderful feeling, a wonderful concept. You get something done, get finished calving in the spring, that's a good feeling. Get finished combining in the fall, that's a good feeling. If it just goes on and on and on and on, that wears on you after a while. I think from Jesus' example and Paul's example, Christians need to plan to get finished. If you're going to get finished, you got to know what you're doing. If your job is to go to church, you're never going to get finished, right? You're going to go to church for Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. That's not what you're trying to get finished. What you're trying to get finished is you are witnesses. You are a bold, joyful, all of the emotions that we've just been talking about, witness. That's your job. You just do that as natural as could be, because that's your job. And when you do get to the end, then you won't have the sadness. One of the saddest times I can remember in my life was with a friend visiting his dad, who was just a couple days from dying, and the dad whispered, "I don't know whether I've done enough or not." Wouldn't that be sad to come to that point in your life and wonder whether you've done enough? Let me assure you, you haven't done enough to earn getting into heaven. The whole theological basis of that is off track. But you need to figure out what your job is. Your job is to be a witness. None of this deserting stuff. You are a witness. That will move you then from being unbelieving to believing. Switch over to the Gospel of John, chapter 20, 28, 29. Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." After Thomas has doubted, been an unbeliever, "I don't believe it." And Jesus convinces him. Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." I don't know whether you've thought about that or not. Sometimes I've thought, sometimes I hear people say, if I could have just lived with Jesus, then I'd be a believer. If I could have seen him do his miracles, then I'd have been a believer. Thomas saw all that too, you know. That's not what made him a believer. He didn't believe until he actually put his finger in his hands and his hand in his side. And I want to encourage you with Jesus' blessing. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who have not seen." That's us. That's a blessing promised to us if we put our faith, if we put our confidence in Jesus. That promise is for us that there's a blessing, more blessing than those who had to see proof. So if you believe without proof, you are more blessed than those who have to have proof. That's a different concept than what we're used to, isn't it? John 20, verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Mary moves from hopeless. The women are been trusting in Jesus. He's been crucified, died, laid in the tomb. They're bringing spices to anoint his body. So I was rereading that, I thought, how did they think they were going to get the stone out of the way to do that anyway? Who were they going to hope there's people standing by that would do it, or how? But however they were going to do that, they wondered that too as they went along the road, but they didn't have it planned out ahead. But they are going there with a hopeless feeling. Mary is crying and hopeless. All of her hopes have been dashed, and she is hopeless. She moves from hopeless to hopeful. I think hopeless is one of, if not the worst word in the English language. Hopeless destroys everything. I told you about our book club this month in April. We're reading Unbroken of Louis Zaprini, being captured by the Japanese, drifted on the Pacific Ocean for 47 days on a raft, and then landed on the Japanese island to be tortured by them. But through it all, he constantly reminded himself to keep hope. Those who didn't manage to keep their hope died. Those who managed to keep hope lived through that. Hopeless is the reason for our epidemic of suicide in our country. Hopeless destroys marriages. Hopeless destroys homes. Hopeless causes failure at school or work. Hopeless causes people to give up on whatever, church or whatever. Hopeful, if you can keep hope alive, You can keep going no matter what. Hope is what keeps us going. That leads then to John chapter 21:17. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. I would have loved to have heard Peter's real tone, how he said that. Jesus said, Take care of my sheep. Love is a verb. Love is not a noun. Love is not a thing. Love is an action. It's taking care of sheep. It's a lot of work. I want you to think about all of the contrasts that we've talked about and think of them on a basis of a continuum. That contrasts are a continuum. There's an arrow to the left and an arrow to the right. The disciples, in these couple chapters that we've talked about, moved a lot of things on the continuum from the left to the right. I want you to think about a phrase. Direction is always more important than position. Where you're at on the line with any of these contrasts is not near as important as which direction you're going. If you're way over on the right, but your direction is going to the left, you're going the negative direction. Even if you're over on the left, if you're moving to the right, you are going the right direction. You will get there eventually. This Christian living is a long process. This is a lifetime job we're at. The direction is always more important than the position. Not everybody understands that, not everybody believes that, but I want to encourage you to think about that pretty deep. And I want to encourage you to think about the different contrasts that we've gone through and think about where you are on those. Maybe useful to think about where was Jesus in each of those? And you might say, well, you don't understand all of the things that have happened to me and parents that I had, childhood I had, teachers I had, whatever. You don't understand why I'm way over there. But where was Jesus? And you're claiming to be like Jesus, and you're claiming to follow Jesus' example, and you're claiming to want to be more and more like Jesus. Where have you got to get to? You got to get on the line to where Jesus was on the line. And so I want you to think about that. Maybe something has triggered something with you out of those, and you thought, oh man, I wish I had a list of those. I do have paper copies of the PowerPoint if that's useful to you afterwards. But I would like for you to think about whatever things out of there struck a chord with you, and think about where Jesus was, where you are, and which direction you're going. This is a hopeful, wonderful day. He is risen. He is risen indeed. We have every reason to be way over on the right with all of those things. And if you're not there, that's okay. Just get the direction going the right way. That's what I want to encourage you with this morning, is the direction. We'll have a song and got to have announcements in church, so we'll have those.
This concludes our service for today. Thank you for joining us this week through our online presence at Parkland Bible Church. If you're ever in the Kipling area or live nearby, we would love for you to join us in person. You are always welcome. If you have any questions from this week's message, or have a prayer request, or would like to learn more about developing a relationship with Jesus, we're here to help. You can reach us by calling 306-736-2421 or by emailing to parklandagc@sasktel.net. Thank you again for joining us today. May God bless you and keep you. We look forward to being with you next week.